Greetings, Code Monkeys, and welcome back to CodedLockFilms. And now Superhero Month officially begins with Iron Man. Iron Man was kind of a surprise hit in some regards because he was one of those characters that, before the movies came out, not a whole lot of people really knew much about him unless they were part of comic book geekdom. Like, there are some superheroes that pretty much everybody's heard of and knows something about, you know, like Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, those kinds of characters. And the Iron Man series overall does do a pretty good job of delving into the psychology of this very brilliant but incredibly flawed and in some ways broken man. Tony Stark is a character all about struggling with one's personal demons. Paranoia, alcoholism, post-Avengers PTSD even. And because of his paranoia and his general inability to trust almost anybody but himself, Tony Stark has a lot of, shall we say, not so positive ways of dealing with his issues. And because of that, he kind of ends up causing most of his own problems. Most of the bad stuff in Tony Stark's life can be directly traced back to him being an asshole. Basically, Tony's character growth is all about him learning how not to be a self-centered dick. Okay, so after 3 solo movies, 2 Avengers flicks, and Civil War, he's still kind of a self-centered dick, but he's definitely less of one. And it's easy to tell by watching the movies that he is a good person, if not precisely a nice one, and he is really trying to do better. But no matter how hard he tries, he just seems to keep screwing up over and over and over again. Which is actually pretty engaging to watch. He's sort of a tragic figure in that regard. Actually, if any of you remember the Veds video from last year where we were talking about modern-day equivalents of Greek tragic heroes, Tony Stark is actually a pretty good fit for that upon reflection. He has this constant determination to fix everything personally and maintain direct control over every single aspect of his world. And that allows him to accomplish some pretty amazing things, but it also proves to be his greatest flaw and his near constant downfall. This emphasis on personal control and dissatisfaction incidentally also makes him a really good foil to Captain America, because Steve Rogers generally has this philosophy of kind of taking things as they come and accepting that no one man should have absolute control over anything except himself. But we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into Captain America and the Avengers movies. What I'll say for now is that it is really fascinating over the course of the Iron Man movies to watch Tony Stark kind of struggling to find his place to some degree within the world, but also within himself. Like, he's never really satisfied and he always wants to do more, but he doesn't know when to stop, and he often spends too much time thinking about what he could do as opposed to whether or not he should do it, all of which is essentially motivated by his own sense of personal guilt, which began in Iron Man 1. Now, the first movie has definitely started to show its age a little bit. Like, the pacing is a little bit off from time to time, and it was also the birth of a pretty big albatross around the Marvel Cinematic Universe's neck, which is that the villains in the Marvel movies tend to be kind of unmemorable and uninteresting, and that's definitely the case with Ironmonger in this movie. To be fair, Jeff Bridges does a pretty good job with what he's given, but ultimately he's not given very much. Like, the whole Ironmonger thing really is very much an afterthought in the movie, and his whole plan just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you get right down to it. But more important is watching the slow burn creation of Iron Man himself. And the first movie is a really good sort of nutshell, kind of a snapshot of who Tony Stark is and what motivates him. And that work that was done in the first movie is pretty effectively carried over into the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The second movie is kind of a mixed bag. Overall, it's not terribly important to the grander events of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It does introduce Black Widow, but honestly, Black Widow isn't a character that needs very much introduction. Although Scarlett Johansson does do a good job in this movie, even though she's wearing this really crappy, fake-looking wig that is honestly really distracting every time I see it. But that's a minor quibble, I understand. it was such a crappy wig. Could we not have... Forget it. Moving on. And this movie really does have a feeling of kind of being thrown together at the last minute. It's very much a holding pattern kind of movie. Story-wise, it really treads water. It doesn't do much to develop any of the characters to any significant degree. Once again, the villain is kind of crappy and forgettable, although he does look really cool, and I really like the whole electric whip thing, which easily could have looked really, really cheesy and stupid, but honestly was pretty cool to watch. But ultimately, because this movie was kind of a holding pattern and not really meant to advance anything significantly because they were kind of saving that for the Avengers, it ends up just kind of biding its time, and as a result, it's kind of forgettable. And if there's any movie in the overall Marvel Cinematic Universe that's pretty okay to just skip entirely, this would probably be it. At least in terms of understanding the broader overall story of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because it doesn't really contribute to that story in any way that's terribly significant. The third movie, however, is a really satisfying close to the Iron Man series. Not to Iron Man as a character, obviously, because, you know, he's been in movies past the end of Iron Man 3, but to the Iron Man series specifically, it's a really satisfying conclusion. Oh man, Jesus Christ. It is getting really freaking hot in here. Oh. Okay, you know what, that's just gonna stay there until I'm done filming for the day. For one thing, the whole relationship with Tony Stark and Pepper Potts gains some very much needed depth in this movie. Up until this point, Tony's relationship with Pepper had been more interesting in theory than in execution because it was all just very surface level, and a lot of that is just a matter of the relationship not having been given very much screen time up until this point. And this is a relationship that needs a lot of screen time to develop because Tony and Pepper are both characters who are kind of closed off and flippant, who don't like to express their true feelings very readily or very often. Really, the thing that this movie does best out of the Iron Man series is those interpersonal relationships. Once again, we see some sort of aspect of Tony Stark's past coming to haunt him like we did in the first two Iron Man movies. The first movie having been the whole his father's company producing weapons thing. The second movie having some personal history with the villain that actually, when you get right down to it, isn't all that personal or even terribly interesting, but again, we're done with movie 2 for now. And finally, the Iron Man movies have done something interesting with the villain. And in order to talk about why I like what they did with the villain in this movie so much, I kind of have to talk a little spoilery here, so on the off chance that you haven't seen Iron Man 3, I will give that warning, but honestly, it's been long enough, so I don't really feel all that bad talking about it. But if for some reason you do intend to see it and somehow still haven't, then I guess you can skip to this time signature here and then just pick up watching the video at that point. So one of the problems actually with Iron Man as a character, even in the comic books, is that his villains are really not all that memorable or iconic. But the one exception to that is a character called the Mandarin. The Mandarin is a dude who has these rings that appear to be magic but are actually just really advanced technology. But the problem with the Mandarin is that he is very much rooted in a particularly problematic period of American storytelling. For a certain period of time in American entertainment media, there was this tendency to use a lot of vaguely Eastern-inspired mysticism as a way to basically put wizards into otherwise fairly realistic settings, and it was written off with basically ancient Chinese secret. Yeah, it was super racist, and the Mandarin from the comic books is very much steeped in that period of American entertainment media, so you can't really do that kind of character in a modern story because it's just not gonna work. And it shouldn't work because, again, it's super racist. But at the same time, he's the only one of Iron Man's villains that is at all memorable, and he's kind of the Iron Man villain for that reason. And so how do you do an Iron Man series without tackling the Mandarin at some point? So they get around this in a number of ways. The first of which is that they keep his ethnicity sort of vague. He seems to be some sort of vaguely, like, Middle Eastern, Arabic, possibly Egyptian kind of ethnicity. rather than anything explicitly like Chinese. And they kind of play him up as being sort of this mastermind behind all these different really nasty events, to the point that he's kind of a mystical Osama bin Laden almost. And he so perfectly encapsulates a lot of modern day American fears that it almost seems intentional, like he was explicitly designed to be that way. And it turns out that he was. The Mandarin is just an actor who is playing this role as kind of a look over here, rope-a-dope red herring kind of thing to distract from the actual villain's eventual plan. And this aspect of the movie was controversial. There were a lot of people that really hated this, but honestly, I loved it. I thought it was unique, I thought it was fresh, I thought it was interesting, and if it seems like it could potentially come off as kind of racist, that he's basically designed to be this Middle Eastern mysticism type character rather than a Chinese mysticism type character, it's because, surprise, he's actually supposed to come off like that. He is supposed to appeal to modern day American prejudices, because he was designed that way by the bad guy. Ben Kingsley is a fantastic presence when he's doing his whole the Mandarin thing, and he's absolutely hysterical when you actually meet the actor behind the Mandarin. I loved the Mandarin. I thought that he was one of the best things about the entire Iron Man series, and really one of the better things about the Marvel Cinematic Universe overall. I thought he was probably the most creative they've so far been with a villain. Another thing that the movie does really well is that Tony Stark, for a period of time, has a sort of friendly relationship with this little kid. And it's honestly pretty entertaining and endearing, which is no small accomplishment, because usually the smart-alecky little kid is one of the worst things about any movie that is not explicitly designed to feature the smart alecky little kid, because it's kind of nice to see Tony Stark getting a taste of his own smart-ass medicine. And overall, the series leaves Tony Stark's character development in pretty much the perfect place to pick up with Avengers 2 and Captain America Civil War, but again, more on that later. On the worth meter, I would say that Iron Man 1 is worth renting, Iron Man 2 is worth borrowing, and Iron Man 3 is worth owning. Overall, I think it's a pretty good series, but I feel like it's not the type of series, at least for me personally, that keeps you coming back over and over and over again. You'll watch them, you'll enjoy them, maybe you'll watch them again from time to time, but in the broader context of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I don't think that this is the series that most people are going to reach for off the shelf over and over again. Please join me again in a couple of days when we are going to be talking about Thor. And until then, Code Monkeys, I will see you later.